All right, everyone. Welcome to the Stoa. Very excited for this session today. We have Puru with us from the blog website Puru the Guru. Puru's really hard to describe. He's basically like a Renaissance man, PhD in finance. He's a writer and really big into health. And I think that's what he's become known for with his blog. He's really concerned with having individuals live a long and healthy life. And the title of his blog is The Refusal to Think is Evil. And I really love coming across someone who's an original thinker and who is approaching problems from new ways. And one of my philosophical coaching partners recommended Puru to me, specifically his writing on fasting, which is quite good, which we might talk about today. There's an article that he wrote called The Implementation Gap, which I'll allow Puru to explain. And that's sort of the launching point of today's conversation, but it might go all sorts of different places. So how today's going to work, I'm going to tag in Puru in a moment. He'll share his thoughts on the implementation gap, and then him and I will have a conversation. And if you have any question, throw them in the chat. I'll call on you, unmute yourself. You can ask your question to Puru. If you don't want to be on YouTube, just indicate that and I'll read your question on your behalf. And it's a little bit intimate crowd today, so everyone feel free to turn on their camera as well, so we can get some light in the Stoa. And we're here for about 60 minutes in total. So that being said, if I missed anything in introducing you, Puru, just feel free to introduce yourself, but welcome to the Stoa, my friend. Oh, you're on mute. I forcefully put you on mute in the beginning. There you go.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here today. It's hello to everybody. I'm not going to say good morning or good evening because it's just about turning into sunset here in Mumbai, where I'm, I could say stuck, but I'll try to make the most of every place that I'm at. So I think that's not necessarily a bad thing. So we're supposed to have rains here in Mumbai. That we're in the month of July. It's the month with maximum rain, but it's been a week of July and we've had pretty much no rain, and the temperature was 40 degrees today, which is about 104 Fahrenheit. But again, I took advantage of the fact that we have sunlight as opposed to clouds and got some sun exposure. So the reason I decided to pick this specific topic was because it is specific but very broad. So I understand why it is that you at first suggested that I might speak about fasting, and I think that's a fantastic topic to speak on. And I think my take on it is also, in some sense, an example of how I use this implementation gap. So, just as an example, or I'll come back to why I call it what I do when I talk about fasting. So this idea of the implementation gap came to my mind about 10 years ago, when I sort of in my early 40s decided that I was no longer going to be podgy and unfit and do something about my physical health. I had young kids and I didn't want them to see me, to see their father being just another middle-aged Indian man with, just a focus on making rich people richer, which does get boring after a while. And so I followed a typical geek approach that I do with just about everything. And I noticed around me that my colleagues, who were typically about 15 years younger than I was, I worked in a financial services trading firm, and they were typically in their mid-20s, and I was in my early 40s. And they were just not able to get fitter, and they really needed it. They really needed to figure out some way to reverse the poor health that they'd been sliding into since leaving college. And it struck me then that compared to when I was a child, where knowledge was typically a bottleneck, if you couldn't buy a book or borrow it or steal it, if you were lucky if you had access to a library and could do that easily, but knowledge was a bottleneck, because even if you could access a library, it wasn't always so easy to get to a library and borrow a book and get the answer that you wanted or get it soon enough. And then it struck me that now knowledge is no longer a bottleneck, right? In fact, information or knowledge is perhaps, we might say that today we have information overload. So what is then the problem? Why aren't people, super fit, super sexy, super rich, super happy? And it just basically comes down to obviously an implementation problem, right? There is a gap, and that's what I refer to when I talk about the implementation gap. So then you might think, well, okay, what's the big deal? Why talk about it? But if you think about it, this gap exists everywhere. It's like this big elephant in the room. You look at just about any setting, any scenario, and you see that there is this problem of an implementation gap. And you can see it from birth to death. In fact, even before birth, if you think about, perhaps not in all countries, and it's a function of the incentive structures that are set up, but in a place like India, I can tell that the number of cesarean births is way higher than it needs to be. And it's only because typically doctors have made more money if they do C-sections when a child is born. So clearly there's a problem, because it's not just about paying money to get a C-section, but the fact that once your child is born, if they've gone through non-natural vaginal birth, then they're going to have certain health issues that they wouldn't that they wouldn't if they had a natural birth. So we have this problem where people are doing things in a sort of suboptimal manner. Sometimes they think they're doing the right thing, but they're not. And we see this all around us. We don't have to go to rich countries with what we might call the standard American diet, but even in sort of middle income countries where people aren't living their lives in a traditional manner, people's health is suffering. And so that's something everybody can see. You don't have to live in sort of Toronto or London or Mumbai. You go to even a village in India where now people have access to television and the media and processed and packaged foods, and their health is suffering. So we have this health-related problem around us, and that everybody suffers, can experience. But this exists throughout our lives. So when children go to school, they leave school having been taught a second language, but not being able to speak it. And it's quite shameful that you can go, even in a place like Toronto, I believe, children go to school, have French taught to them in school, but when they leave school at 15 or 16, they're not fluent. I mean, only a small fraction might be fluent. But so you get what I mean. There is this problem, and the same problem exists in India too. We're a country with so many languages. Each state sort of mandates that the children learn the state language too. But children for whom that's not a mother tongue end up leaving school without being able to speak it. And that's really quite shameful, because it's a waste of resources, right? It's children's time, the time of teachers, parents who are earning money to send their kids to school to learn a language as part of their curriculum aren't getting what they paid for. So we have this suboptimality that exists everywhere. So in terms of physical health, we have people who aren't getting to somewhere close to peak physical health. We've got children who aren't learning things the way they should. And this is, you might say language skills are, special skills, but they're not. Everybody can speak multiple languages if they wish to, with ease, if the implementation gap is closed. And it's as simple as that. And similarly with math skills, we think of, that only some kids are good at maths and others are not. But no, it's actually a problem of implementation. How is mathematics taught? If you leave school without being able to speak, a second or third language, fine, you might get by. But it's no good if you've left school with a poor handle on simple arithmetic and maths and things like that. So, and this problem persists across domains within sort of the school system or the education system. So we know the education system as it runs in just about every country in the world is about 100 years out of date. There's too much time is spent on a few subjects that should only have only a little bit of time dedicated to them. And a lot of other subjects should be introduced that are probably more useful for the 21st century. Partly because they're useful for when people leave college or school and go into get jobs. And they don't have the requisite skills in order to be useful to employers. But beyond that, even beyond just education for a job, it's about getting the right skills so that you can survive in the real world as an individual and when interacting with others. So, a simple thing like it would be so much better if instead of having, 9 years of history, drilled into you in school, and that too not a fair representation of history, probably history as written by such certain agenda setters. Perhaps a couple of years of history, but maybe with a couple of years of psychology would be good, right? Mandatory, or a couple of years of personal finance, a couple of years of computer programming skills, mandatory, right? And taught in the right way. So everything comes down to this sort of implementation gap. Why is it that two students can spend 2 hours each in a room with books, but one of them leaves having understood the material so much better than the other, right? Clearly, it's because there's something that doesn't go right with how the second student implements their study technique. And the reason that this is a problem is, again, because of the system, right? So when we go to school, we're told what to study, but we're not told how to get that knowledge, right? We're given the knowledge, but we're not taught how to learn. So, a simple thing like, so one of the most popular MOOCs that's around is learning how to learn. It's, just students, for it to be mandatory that all students are taught how to learn first before they're taught what to learn would be a good thing, right? And it's just so simple to do it. It is no additional cost on the system. And this is just another big example of an implementation gap, and why I call it an elephant in the room, because it's huge, this problem, and no one's doing anything about it. And you wonder why. People just seem to going about their day and their lives in a way where it seems to not so much matter so much at all. And I guess the reason that this hits home for me is because of what I do on a daily basis. So I spend a huge chunk of my day on studying and implementing longevity protocols, both for myself and for those I mentor. And I can see how just having the theory is not good enough, but to know how to implement the theory is important. So, I've got this moniker, Puru the Guru, or some people might call me an urban guru. But the fact of the matter is I'm a geek, and probably the better two words to describe me is a practical geek. So, I worked as an experimental physicist at one time. I studied engineering, but at some level, I love theory, and I love taking theory to practice. And I've done this. Again, it's about implementation. Even something like this I've implemented. So I've studied pretty much all the way through my life. I started my PhD when I was 29 after actually training as an actuary, and not many people do that. Once you're an actuary, you're supposed to be on the path to high income. Why would you go off and then do 5 research in a completely different field? So I've had this through my life where I've tried to implement theory and practice, and even my PhD is I think a lovely blend of moving away from most of economics, which is not very useful. It's theoretical, it's mathematical, but doesn't really relate to solving real world problems, to actually doing things with real data and finding out solutions to problems, or trying to explain the world as it is, as opposed to this is how the world should be as per our models and our assumptions. So sort of putting all of this together and seeing that even when it comes to helping individuals, it's not just so simple as to say, look, you know what? You need to exercise every day, you need to have good sleep, and you need to eat right? Those are the sort of broad principles, we know them. But how do you implement them? right? How do you go about implementing those specific broad guidelines? And this is where it comes down to details. So you've got this sort of theory, you can look up published research, but then you've got to figure out how to implement it. And when you come to implement anything, you don't have infinite resources. People don't have infinite amounts of time and or money. And besides that, everyone's got a sort of limited capacity for what they can tolerate. So a simple thing like willpower, telling someone, look, you've got to develop better willpower and not do this. It's a silly thing to say to people because, we know that willpower is not, typically is not the bottleneck for people to get to success, right? It's typically about setting the right environment. So again, a simple example of how closing the implementation gap by setting the environment rather than just telling somebody you got to work harder, you've got to have more willpower, you got to make sure you don't give in, right? Now, those little points about you shouldn't give in perhaps matter at a micro level, like, hey, you're at the gym and you're lifting that weight. I want you to really concentrate and do one extra rep and think about how you made it to the gym. So now make it count, right? So that's sort of one of the mottos I use. So you can use mottos and you can use broad principles, but you can't just tell someone that, look, you know what, you just sort your life out. You got to have more willpower. You've got to figure out ways to implement things at a practical level. And whether it's internal wealth, so physical health, mental, emotional, sort of spiritual, or even external wealth, if you think of, people are told, look, you've just got to save more if you want to have a comfortable retirement. But, that's great in theory. And what typically happens is, like for instance, if I think back to my time in the UK when successive governments trying to bring in schemes to help people save on their taxes and invest for their future, what typically happens is the people who take advantage of those are the ones who actually have no problem with saving, right? They're the ones who have money and who have the ability to save and save on their taxes. And the real people who need it, who will need it in the future, their pension savings, they're not the ones who take advantage of it. So again, you have an implementation gap. So the question is, how do you close these implementation gaps? And you can have broad principles as to how to think about this, but it'll always come down to details. And even in those details will come certain principles, because at the end of the day, what we're talking about is changing people's behaviors, right? Because when you change your behavior or your actions, you'll get a different set of results. And you're going to get the change in behavior when you change your mindset or your sort of thought process. So you can have sort of broad principles around that. So like a really simple thing is to say, so what I generally do is I start off with a base assumption that there is an implementation gap. Whatever it is the problem is or the situation, I believe there's an implementation gap. And you might kind of put it in another way, a sort of a synonym, and say that everything is broken, right? And that might be a pessimist way to look at it. And I kind of say that, combine a pessimist and an optimist view. So I start off saying everything is broken, but everything can be improved, right? So I go off always looking with the belief that nothing is perfect, and nothing is perfect doesn't make me depressed, because if I know that nothing is perfect, there is no base case to be depressed about or relative to. So I say nothing's perfect, so I can always look to improve on it. And that's sort of the optimist, the flip side of it, the optimist angle. So I start off with everything's broken to everything can be improved. And then say, okay, given that everything has a gap, I'm going to go on looking for this gap and try to close the gap. So I'm going to have this mindset that there is this ability, or I have decided that I'm going to now close this gap. So then you might say, okay, well, what's going to help then? And then, one of the sort of mindsets to have is that of a growth mindset as opposed to a fixed mindset. To tell yourself that I'm not fixed in time. I might look the same from one day to the next, from 1 year to the next, but I'm not the same person. And none of us is the same. Change is the only constant. So I'm going to have a growth mindset. I'm not going to say, oh, I can't do this. I'm not going to be limited by labels that others put on me or I put on myself. I'm going to tell myself that I'm pretty much capable of doing anything. Now, that sounds like a grand statement, but kind of given enough time, any of us can do just about anything within our genetic limits, right? So I'm not going to be able to fly unless I'm in an aircraft because I'm a human being. And but perhaps I can jump higher if I keep training for it, right? So to just understand our limits and to understand that most of us, if you look at most individuals who are not at the level of Olympic athletes or Nobel laureates, then they're all working at well below their potential in just about everything that they could potentially do. Or to put it more accurately, people are working at well below 50% in a wide range of things that they don't need to be working at below 50%. So someone who's a star hedge fund manager, and that's all he does. He's very good at picking stocks or whatever be the type of hedge fund he manages. He might be fantastic at that, but he's probably, or it's quite common for him to be living at well below his physical best, well below his ability to handle many other things that he would rather do in his life if he wasn't a hedge fund manager. And it's as simple as this, that if we just think a little bit harder about how to close implementation gaps on a daily basis, we'll just get better and better at getting close to our genetic potential. So, I'll never be I shouldn't say never, but it's highly unlikely that I'll be a performance musician on a stage ever. But nothing stops me from being the best musician that I can be, right? Even if it's an instrument I've never played before. The question is, I've got to just decide how I'm going to allocate my time to each of these things that I'm interested in. And what we know is that if we even look at the big picture, so if we think of ourselves as being socioeconomic animals, we know that just about every one of us is running behind money because we want that's available to us in the future when we're older, so that when we can't work and earn money, we've got money to put bread on the table and pay our hospital bills. And what we end up doing, again, this is suboptimality. It's again an implementation gap. Most people die leaving behind too much wealth, right? We can see this. This is not me being, this is just me being descriptive. This is me just telling you that this is the problem that exists. Even in a country like India, where I am right now, when I ask people, hey, do you know anyone who's died without any money, right? And I'm sort of speaking to the to the many millions who speak English as either their first or second language, right? So they've had some amount of education. There are millions of these. I've never heard anyone say, yes, I know somebody who died with no money, right? I mean, it's a very rare case. And typically people will say, yes, just about everyone I know, when they died, left behind quite a lot of wealth. And we know that this is sort of suboptimal because what we want to basically do is, on the day that you die, have just like $1,000 in the bank. Now, the reason that we can't do that is because we don't know when we're going to die. So we end up saving more than we really need because we typically are sort of risk averse, or actually more appropriately, we're loss averse. So we don't want to face the pain of maybe one day we won't have money. But what ends up happening is we oversave. And oversaving basically means we've overworked at some point, right? And so there is that suboptimality. And if you go back to even at the times when Keynes wrote, he predicted that we'll be at a time when we won't need to work many hours in a week, maybe 15 hours of the week, and we'd all have very happy, comfortable lives. But that's not how we're living today, right? We have so much wealth around us and resources. We have so much of everything, but we're just not able to have that optimality in terms of internal wealth, right? So when I talk about internal wealth, I'm talking about physical, mental, emotional, and if you like, spiritual wealth. And the key reason we don't have it is because we don't spend the appropriate amount of time on the things that really matter. We end up spending our time on things that we think matter, but actually we're not even thinking hard enough about it. So that's sort of the reason why I now do what I do, because I see, everyone I mentor is wonderful and wonderful in their own way. And I'm really happy when they come to me and we work together, because I can give them a different perspective, yet take them to their goals and empower them and teach them how they can kind of get to their goals, because everyone's goal is different, right? My goals are very different from the next person's, and my current situation is different from the next person's, and my preferences and constraints are different. So this is a sort of dynamic optimization problem. And what I typically do is teach people how to constantly focus on closing this implementation gap and learning how to constantly look out for and close the implementation gap. So don't just give them fish, but sort of teach them how to fish. So I teach people how to close the implementation gap. And to the extent that people want to know about the knowledge, right, what's great is that it exists very easily at the end of a Google search, right? So, just literally 2 hours ago, someone I mentored who thought they were, losing too much weight, asked me what is an ideal body fat percentage. And my response was, well, you were afraid you had too little body fat, but now that you've bought a fat measurement meter, you can see if you Google that you're not anywhere close to the bottom of the healthy range. So that's not the problem. The problem is you don't have enough muscle on your body, right? So understanding this simple practical thing, that just standing on a weighing scale and seeing that your weight is low and that your BMI looks like a low number is not good enough. You need to sort of delve into the details and see that, oh, hang on, but my weight is a combination of muscle and fat and water and organs and everything else. But so it's not just that I'm unhealthy because my total weight is low. It's actually the fact that I'm unhealthy because my fat is high and my muscle percentage is low. So, this it's a very simple, practical example of something that happened literally 2 hours ago, of how each of us needs to think a little bit harder about how to close the multitude of implementation gaps that exist around us, right? All the way from, like I mentioned, before you're born, to childbirth and early childhood, through your education system, learning the requisite skills, how much time you spend out as someone who's producing or contributing to the economy, all the way to the time when you sort of retire and you think you'll need money for your retirement and your health, your hospital bills and other things. So if from a very early age we start understanding this, or we teach this to people who are much younger, that focus on the implementation gap, the implementation gap, they'll all start to think a little bit harder about this idea that the world is not perfect, people's lives are not perfect, mine is not perfect, and therefore, when things are not perfect, that's not a state of, one shouldn't get depressed, because not being perfect is normal. But how can I constantly look to improve? So that's sort of the optimist's perspective. And if I'm going to look to improve, what are the things that I need? And so, of course, you first got to accept that there is this gap. You want to figure out how to close the gap. And then you've got to get execution in place. You've got to say, you know what, I can't just keep thinking about it in theory. I've got to act. So I've got to take the first step. And I've got to understand how I get to success. And I get to success by taking a small step, not by trying to run a marathon in 2 weeks, right? So, it's that little bit every day, 1% improvement every time I show up for training, that's going to make a difference. Or when it comes to wealth, I'm not going to look to double my wealth overnight. I'm not going to become a millionaire next year. I'm going to get rich by saving a little bit every month and putting it away and benefiting from the effect of compounding over time. It's sort of putting all of this together and understanding that everything is interconnected. So my physical health is so interconnected with my mental health, is very interconnected with my emotional health. And there's no way I'm going to be spiritually elevated if I don't take care of these. So, when people talk about spiritual health, but they don't look like they're physically healthy, I'm extremely skeptical about whether that's possible. Because I know now what science tells me about physical health and emotional health. And it might just be a facade when someone looks extremely like they have some serious health problems because they're significantly overweight. And just from the way they speak and breathe, you can tell they have health issues. It's near impossible for me to believe that they're spiritually elevated. It's possible, but I'm just extremely skeptical about it. So I myself, and I tell others that I'd rather that you understand that the only way to touch the spiritual dimension is through the physical. Just like the only way you can, the way we get, so for instance, so I don't play the guitar, but say playing guitar makes me happy, then the only way I can get happy is if I physically pick up the guitar and strum a few chords and the sound waves go to my ears and the motion of my hands is felt by my nervous system, and I understand what those signals mean, and they mean something to me, and that makes me happy, right? So it's the stuff in the physical dimension that translates then into the mental or sort of emotional plane, and therefore the spiritual, right? Like typically in urban centers, we think of spiritual last. In a place like Mumbai, people just tend not to think about it at all. They kind of separate it out completely. It's something that they do a few times of the year in a noisy festival. It's not something that they tend to live through on a sort of a daily basis. People in the West think of India as being, spiritual, but at a practical level, a city like Mumbai, it's just not. It's very much like a New York or London. And so I tell people that, look, get your physical health in order before you even think that you might do something else with your life at a spiritual level when you come to retire. Because if you don't fix your physical health, you will reach retirement and you will suffer aches and pains and wish you could go back in time and fix that, so that you might consider touching the realm of spiritual health. So that's pretty much I've sort of spoken in a very broad sense about how this implementation gap comes into play with the things that I do and why it exists in every dimension. So the people I mentor, many of them have children and thinking about their education, and of course young people and their mental health today, partly because of social media, partly because parents are busier, partly because of COVID. But sort of putting all of these things together, how do we become robust and resilient to all the shocks that life will give us, right? So we've seen, 3 years ago, no one would have predicted we'd be in the situation that we went through in the last year and a half. And who knows what we'll face in the future. But how do we set ourselves up on a daily basis? Because again, we can only do things now and today, right? And we can plan for stuff in the future, and we can have a schedule for how we do things. But how do we do stuff today so that we and our children, and more importantly, the planet around us and our children's children and their grandchildren will sort of have better lives? That's sort of the way I kind of think of connecting everything together. And I really believe everything is connected, not just in terms of these dimensions of physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, but also us relative to everybody else. Sort of, we know that humans are social animals. We're supposed to be in contact with other humans. Loneliness is a terrible epidemic in many countries, but also humans relative to other species and our planet, and thinking about that in a practical way, and thinking about this fact that everything is a sum total of little things that we can do. And the biggest problem with things like global heating today, for instance, is that everybody thinks that they can't make a difference, and it's a problem for everybody else to solve, right? So people just sit back and keep living their lives the way they always have. And I say people because I'm sort of referring to the bulk of the population. There are many of us who do try to make a difference. So like I mentioned, it's 40 degrees today, 104 Fahrenheit. But just for this call, I turned on 2 air conditioners. Normally, I just have a ceiling fan on, just to keep the noise out. But once this call is done, I'll switch those off because I know it's just a small difference, but I know that whatever little I do will help contribute to the betterment of the planet, or at least make me feel like I'm doing something real. And that real is important, not just doing things to sort of hand in homework. So often people will say, oh, I'm going vegan because it's better for the planet. And I'm like, yeah, but you just bought a new SUV when you didn't need to, right? What you had was perfectly fine. And so looking at everything together, again, like the big picture. And I guess perhaps that's one of the other things that I do that allows me to have success with the people I mentor, which is that it's not narrow. Often people have reached out to me thinking I'm a sort of running coach, or I'm just an expert on the theory and practice of fasting, or I seem to have done a lot of research on alcohol and why it's not good for you, or things like that. But the fact of the matter is, as someone who's run multiple businesses, who's sort of has kids who are at university, and gone from being a sedentary geek, hedge fund manager, to being an extreme outlier for my sort of race, age, and gender in terms of physical fitness. So I sort of putting all of that together, it's sort of clear that, hey, you know what, Puru probably knows what he's talking about, because not only does he have the certification to back this, which, and we know certification can be bought if you want to, or you just have to go through the process, but he's able to demonstrate it in the way he lives his own life. And I think this is why I kind of enjoy doing what I do. And it's because I do it for myself. And everything that I do, I try to pass on to others. I do this sort of knowledge transfer, never holding anything back, sort of like a true academic would, I guess. And never having this fear that if I teach someone else what I know, then they will no longer come back to me. Right? If I teach someone to fish, they won't come back and buy fish from me. That's not what my goal is. My goal is to teach people to fish so that they can teach others to fish. And that's sort of, again, part of this implementation gap problem. If I want more people to be better at their lives like I try to be, then I want to teach them how to do the stuff so well that they can then teach others. And of course, the closest people we might teach might be our partners or our children, and then others learn from that too. So that's pretty much, if you ask me to stop now, I can stop rambling on, but that's pretty much how I put together this whole thing as to why I'm speaking about this today and why I think it encompasses everything that I do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. And I love the holistic perspective. And so I have a question, and if anyone else has any questions, just throw them in the chat. We have a few already. So one thing that caught my attention with the implementation gap when you're just talking earlier is about learning. Like that's one of the core components that we need to teach people. And in your blog, you called it meta learning, which I quite like, learning about learning. And there's like this negative association that I think a lot of people have towards learning, just like on a felt sense level. And there's this Polish researcher I quite like that created, I forget his name, but he created the super memo. And his fundamental law of learning is when there's no pleasure, there's no good learning. And he says learning needs to be self-directed and self-paced. And he calls this the learn drive, which is like inherently pleasurable. And you contrast that with the school drive, which has this like reward punishment system, which nicely maps over to your external divide, or like the growth mindset, fixed mindset thing. And then so like the incentive structure like puts emphasis on external validation, like credentials and all that type of stuff. And it really just corrupts and almost traumatizes like us. And then like it makes these myths of learning, like learning is unenjoyable, learning has to be tough, learning has to be this unpleasurable and all that type of stuff. So I'm curious what you think about like this art of meta learning, the practice of meta learning, and how to kind of make like learning pleasurable. So all these myths of learning have to be difficult and whatnot can be disabused.
I'm I'm a lifelong student just by nature, and I keep looking for new interesting skills to pick up. So, and I think all humans are like that. So I think for each person to just understand that we're learning stuff all the time. Uh, it's just that we're not necessarily so a we're if you it's almost like an axiom that humans learn all the time because all creatures learn, right? Even a fly that's flying around is learning about its environment as it's flying, right? It can sense what the weather changes and things like that. So we're all naturally inclined to learning because it's part of evolution and survival. So the question is, A, what should we be learning and how should we be learning? So what we should be learning is often a function of relevance. So a student who's expected to learn about some part of history that seems to have no relevance to them, uh, you can understand why it's difficult to motivate them to understand it or to want to memorize dates and other things. So then it comes down to, of course, we need to learn some history. And it's because of the reasons that we're supposed to study history. And often, for instance, I know when I started my early education in India many years ago, we weren't taught history with a whole section on why we need to study history. It was never addressed in the entire time I was in school. It was more like, this is history, this is the syllabus that's set, and this is what you need to learn. So, and I think of history because it's quite far from all the other things that I do, which is sort of, in some sense, sort of human history. But if it is that we want someone to learn something, the most important thing to do is to explain to them why it's important to them. And then comes the part of how to make it enjoyable. So if I tell somebody that they should learn a second language, they'll say, but why? I've got Google Translate. So why do I need a second language? Or everybody speaks English now around the world. Why do I need to learn French or whatever it might be? And the point is, then you've got to explain to them why it is that they should learn it. And if they then like those reasons and they agree with them and those reasons are strong enough for it to be relevant to them, then they would look to learn the language. And then it comes the question of how do you learn? And I think what the Polish academic said is spot on, right? You've got to make it fun and self-directed. And we know that when we're coming to either to teach, i.e. to make sure that the students' mood is right, or we're learning ourselves, we've got to make sure that we're not stressed and we're not angry and we're sort of not tired and all of those things. Because if a student's tired, child's tired at the end, at the end of the night, and the parents are trying to get them to do their homework, they're not going to be very productive, right? They're better off just saying, look, go to sleep instead of screaming at the child. So there's a lot of these sort of practical implementation problems. And I say this, so I used to, I've been tutoring from the age of 19. And I could see these problems when, looking at how parents would explain to me the problems they're having with their children when they try to teach them themselves. And I could see that this is an issue. So again, it's an implementation gap problem. So when it comes specifically to learning, I think the most important thing is first to get people to understand, or just as two good takeaways to take for everybody who's listening today is spaced learning and spaced repetition. If there were just two things that you needed to take away, there are more useful sort of tips, but spaced learning and spaced repetition. Don't look to sit down for 1 hour and learn something and expect that you will learn it. Instead, do 4 sessions of 15 minutes across 4 days, or better still, do 15 minutes in the morning, 15 minutes tonight, and then 15 minutes tomorrow, and then 15 minutes after 3 days. So you need sort of, there's this exponential decay in memory. So you want to make sure that you spend increasing spaces of time. You increase the spaces of time between your learning sessions. So that's one thing. And the other thing is spaced recall. So you want to be able to recall the stuff that you've learned after some time has gone by. And of course, one of the things that I think everybody should know about now is the illusion of learning. Never ever fall into this illusion that just because you're reading, sort of the illusion of reading, that just because you're reading something, you're learning it. No, you can understand the English, you understand what each word means, but you're not learning it. And true learning only comes when you memorize, right? So there's often this negative feeling people have about memorization. They say, oh, memorization is no good. That's not real understanding. But hey, you know what? You might understand something, but you've not really learned it if after a week, when I ask you something about it, you can't answer because you've forgotten it. So of course you have to understand it, but you need to memorize too. And this is sort of like we've got these two, I won't even call them polar opposites, but people think of Asia being a part of the world where people do a lot of rote learning, and the West is where it's just more focused on understanding and sort of inquiry. And what we need is both, right? Because once you do that understand and inquiry, in order to build on it, you need to memorize what you've just discovered with your inquiry, right? So, and that's how you keep building on that. And I tend to do both. So I should just tell you that every day I focus on engaging with 14 languages. So for me to touch 14 languages every day and to get each of them increasing in my ability to handle them, obviously needs me to be motivated. So I need to have a reason why I'm doing it. And it needs me to have an implementation gap closed, right? And sort of I end up doing those. And like I mentioned in the blog on the implementation gap and across a lot of my writings, it's very important to document and journal what you're doing, right? It can be very simple things. So I might just put a flag of 1 next to each language saying, I touched it today, right? Like I spent a few minutes speaking to someone in the language, or I listened to a podcast, or I listened to an old radio recording, or I read a news article or something like that. So it could be just something like that, or it could be more qualitative, where I might talk about something I did specifically. Like I went to the shop in this part of town and I spoke the language of the shopkeeper, right? And whose mother tongue is not the same as mine, and it's a language I'm learning. So that might be something that I kind of make a mention of. So, and you could do something similar for everything that you're doing. So if someone there are lots of youngsters out there, and maybe some of them are learning Python. So rather than just learn the programming language of Python, maybe keep a journal of how your learning is going and write a couple of lines every day about what you learned. And just that process will keep you engaged, because every day you come back to your log and you say, oh, hang on, I didn't spend any time learning Python today. So I'm glad I have this journal, because it reminds me to do it, and it gets me to focus my learning based on the journaling. So I won't just do any random, hand in the homework kind of work where I'm just writing a couple of lines of code, but not really with any proper direction.
Yeah, I love that. We really need to kind of have a learning culture that's lifelong. So let's see if Puru, are you okay to stay after the hour?
Sure.
Yeah, just to squeeze in like a couple questions. Kevin, you had a question. I'll take you in.
Yeah, hey Puru, how you doing?
Hey, Karen.
Yeah, I'm totally with everything you're saying. I'm looking, I'm looking around in my own sorts of personal aspirations, and it seems like there's so many implementation gaps, right? It's like, especially if you're a very creative person, like there's, like hundreds of ideas. It's like, there's all these things you could do. And it's like, it can be, it seems like I start building habits to like lower all these different, to suppress all these implementation gaps. But then it's like these habits like eventually fall apart, or the system sort of decay. And it often feels like, I'm Sisyphus rolling the ball up the hill again. So I'm wondering if like, how do you sort of keep these things maintained over time? And also related to that, like, are there any sort of things or habits or mindsets that are like force multipliers that can sort of, once you affect that, it's goes downstream and just like helps you lower the implementation gap in, like, you know, multiple areas?
So I'll tell you, so there's a couple of ways that I realize that I'm unusual in that, so like I mentioned, I'm extremely fit for my race, age, and gender. And people are really surprised when I tell them I haven't watched sport on TV for like over 30 years. And they're like, what? But you love being physically active. And I'm like, yeah, I love playing football or, you know, just being out running or cycling. But you've got to understand that watching sport is not the same as doing it. Now, someone who does sport and they watch it, I'm like, great. You know, you're someone who has a license to watch sport. But people often watch sport as entertainment. Just like they'll watch Come Dancing, but they've never been dancing in their lives, or they'll watch Wimbledon, but they've never picked up a tennis racket, right? And my point is, learn to. I think one of the best books that I've read so far on productivity has been, or on success has been, one that talks about stopping doing things that you're doing as opposed to focusing on what next to do. So you might be successful despite many of the things that you've done. Often people feel that they're successful because they did X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, no, actually, if you hadn't done X, Y, and Z, you'd have been more successful. So that's one thing that so I don't have a television at home. I had one, but I hadn't used it for a couple of years. So I told my neighbor he could borrow it for an infinite amount of time. I love watching films. I love watching movies. I love watching TV. I'll spend a bit of time every day at my parents' watching television in another language. That is my sort of official mother tongue, just to get better at learning to read the language, right? So I kind of do that, but it's more because I get to spend time with my mother and engage with this language and improve my vocabulary. But otherwise, I think, you know, just simple things like that. Don't spend time doing things that you know are of no use to your future self, right? If you had a conversation with your future self and your future self said to you, Kevin, you know, I really wish you hadn't been doing this every day. And you're like, yeah, you know, that's the thing you want to stop. You talked about creativity. One of the things that I know that would be good to do at a practical level is to be able to time your caffeine consumption. So if you're someone who drinks coffee when you first wake up in the morning, then to understand that that's sort of kind of the wrong time to be taking in a caffeine shot, but to wait to when your cortisol dips, sort of like mid-morning around 10 o'clock, and to then not have caffeine after lunch, after sort of the lunch period, so that you can have a good night's sleep. One of the things that caffeine does is it gets you to focus. So it's really good for analytical work. So if in the first half of the day you do sort of analytical linear thinking type work, then, you know, if you have your caffeine around in the first half of the day, you might find that in the second half of the day, sort of late afternoon, early evening, sunset, and nighttime is when, you know, the caffeine's gone away and you're able to do what's sort of more defocused thinking. So not so so rather than like spotlight, it's sort of more spread out light type of thinking. So it's or sort of diffused mode thinking. So you're more creative then. So you know, one of the things, I guess, you know, I never encourage anyone to drink alcohol, but I'm guessing alcohol has a similar sort of effect, i.e. the opposite of what caffeine does, which is it sort of gets you to sort of, or maybe not alcohol, but some sort of certain psychedelics. So what you want to have is this sort of diffused brain state to be creative. So what I tend to do is so I think of myself as being quite creative too, in very odd ways. I don't do art and of any kind or music. I love listening to music, but I don't play any instruments. I like to think of being creative in terms of the software I design, or the articles I write, or how I construct certain arguments or solve certain problems. And one of the things that I do is I have the space that I'm sitting in right now, and it's quite large. So what I'll do is I'll get up and walk around as if I'm talking to a friend, and I'll walk and I'll talk. And as you know, sometimes when you're talking to someone about your problems, you're actually not talking to them. You're actually talking to yourself. You think you're talking to them. By talking to them, you figure out the solution to your problem. And you think it's been great that you had a friend to listen to you because it helped you solve your problem. But actually, all you were doing was talking. And you just needed that friend to be there as a sort of like almost like a mannequin, right? So what you can try to do is develop this practice of spending time with yourself, just walking. Don't have your phone or other things. Don't listen to anything. Just sort of walk around in a space in your home and think about a specific problem you had. So that's one thing. The other thing that I do is and this sounds really weird to a lot of people until they look into the neuroscience of it, is I load up a lot of problems into my brain before I go to sleep. So people will say, look, you don't want to go to bed thinking about all kinds of things that stress you out. And yeah, I don't want to think about things that stress me out. But if I've got certain problems I'm trying to solve, rather than use that narrow, linear, spotlight focused approach of sit down and try to solve this problem, I'll curate solutions across many days. And one of the times one of the things I'll do is for the across day thing, I get my brain to work on the problem by loading it into my brain just before I sleep. So I take only a few minutes to fall asleep. And in this few minutes, I'll quickly think through all the main problems that I'm looking to solve that I haven't got a solution for. And I know that the beauty of sleep is that it helps you solve problems without you consciously spending time on it during the day, right? And of course, then that ends up freeing up your day for other things. And I really encourage you to try this because I thought of this many years ago and I sort of been practicing it, and I really think that it helps. I haven't logged this as such, collected documented evidence for myself saying, look, I thought about these problems on these specific nights, and on the next day I had a solution. But I can generally sense, and maybe it's anecdotal, but I generally sense that this works. And so I kind of have this practice going. And so, that's another thing that I encourage you to do, whether you're in the creative field or not, right? All of us have problems. All of us have problems that don't have, automatic solutions, right? There could be something as simple as, I want to be able to go scuba diving because I've never done it, but I live in a part of the world where it's not easy to go scuba diving, or it's not fun to go scuba diving. How am I going to solve this problem? All right. And you don't have to sit down and Google and say, where can I go scuba diving? But just hold that in your head. And as you Google across many days, the problem sits in your head, and you give yourself not an infinite number of days, but a large enough number of days, and a beautiful solution will come to you. And it'll end up being beautiful because it'll be the most time efficient and cost efficient solution for you.
Any follow-up, Kevin?
No, thank you. I mean, just one little comment on your caffeine thing. I've noticed that it's better if I start the day without coffee and don't wait and half an hour or an hour after I've started working on something to actually get the caffeine going, because I feel like if I drink the coffee right away, for some reason it affects my productivity or my ability to focus on it. So yeah, thanks.
I'm taking away those two techniques, the walking around talking to yourself, and then the priming your mind with a problem before you sleep. And I'm going to try that out. Christo, you had a question.
Thanks, Peter. Hi, Puru.
Thanks,
a lot
Christo.
of what you shared resonates deeply. And one of the things that I've been interested in is these check-ins with oneself. You can do that collectively as well. It could be like a mid-year review, or it could be a weekly review. So I'm very curious when it comes to the implementation gap, once you've identified different elements like a health implementation gap or a finance one, when do you check in with yourself? Is that on a daily frequency? Is it perhaps something else?
So I guess it's for everything, there's what you might call a half-life, right? So, if you take like a paracetamol, it's got a half-life of, whatever, 6 hours. If you take something for hypothyroidism, the medications typically got a half-life of 7 days. So similarly, any of the problems we're trying to solve might have different time scales. So for instance, it's generally considered healthy to lose up to a pound of fat a week, right? Now, this is based on broad statistics, but for some people, they could lose 2 pounds a week. And for someone else, because they're already very lean, a fraction of a pound is good. So, the details will matter then. And then there are some problems which will need much longer horizons to see success. So for instance, language learning. When people say that they were fluent in French in 8 weeks, right? That's probably because that's all they did for 8 weeks, right? But you can take the smartest person in the world and the smartest polyglot in the world and give them 24 hours with all the books and material they want, and they're not going to be fluent in a day. So some things just naturally take more time, right? If you're going to build muscle, there is a certain time that you need for muscle protein synthesis. So you go to the gym, as soon as you finish your workout at the gym, you're weaker than you were before you enter the gym, right? Because you've got tired now. Your muscles can't do the same amount of work because they've got exhausted. But 48 hours later, your muscles are much stronger, right? So there you've got a half-life which is a bit longer. So depending on what it is that you're looking to do, this period will vary. So, and I do the same thing for myself. So, a simple thing like broad measures. I weigh myself every morning. So I've got thousands of weight measurements. There's something a practice that I do. It's a yogic breathing technique, similar to what free divers would do. So breath holding, and it's something for which there's not much scientifically documented evidence. So I've been collecting data on myself, and that's something I review every day, and I'm absolutely amazed the rate at which the human body can transform itself for something like this. There's with even something like languages, right? There will be languages which are close to the languages that you already know, so your rate of learning will be faster. And then there are languages which are further from the languages that you already know, and therefore the rate of learning will be much slower. So for me to learn Spanish was relatively easy, having English as my first language, not my mother tongue, but my first language. And then after that, trying to learn French became a little easier. I found that German, being close to English, was not as difficult as trying to learn Cantonese, which is just so difficult for me to do, right? I measured those, so I can see that my rate at which I was learning Cantonese was a third of the rate at which I was learning Arabic, which for me was not as sort of from a vocabulary and sound perspective different from some of the Indian languages that I was familiar with. So, but what I said like about journaling, just observing these things and making note of them. So my polyglot log, my log for just my language learning is thousands of lines of just documenting my thoughts and things that I've done, things that I've observed. This is the first time in a public forum that I'm mentioning to anybody that I engage with so many languages. No one's ever heard this before. So, you guys are the first. But yeah, so that's, I don't know if that answers your question, that I kind of do this check on I should tell you, so since this is something that interests a lot of people, which is the financial wealth side of things. So I was in my, mid-20s, training as an actuary, and people generally just thought, okay, you're training as an actuary, or one day you're going to have a lot of money, etc. But it struck me then that, hang on, I don't have a lot of wealth now, but why is it that all the things that we do for multi-billion-dollar pension funds, we don't do for ourselves? So as long ago as almost 30 years ago, I started keeping track of my net worth on a weekly basis. Now, it seems really silly when you don't have much of a net worth to do that. But what it did was build in this discipline where I did it. And, of course, I just bought my first apartment, and most of it was, not owned by me. So, but I could calculate my mortgage value, and I had some approximate value for the home. And of course, those things don't change very much from week to week. But other investments in mutual funds and other things, and your bank balance and other things, those change. So just getting into that habit created this great discipline. And it was also empowering, because within just a few years, I could see that I did not have to work at all, and still could put bread on the table for many years if I wanted to. And it's not because I had a lot of money. It's because I just was aware of how much I had. And most people aren't aware of how much they have, and they think they don't have enough. So they overwork themselves. And therefore, we end up with a situation where they have too much money, but they don't have enough healthy time left, right? So people who are young have a lot of time, but they don't have money. People who are older have money, but they don't have time. And what you've got to do is find this optimal balance between the two.
Awesome.
That's been beautiful. Ngoy, or thank you in Cantonese.
Cool. So we'll close out here. But I guess the last question I have, I'm very curious about your mentorship that you do. Someone's interested here or watching. How does that structured? Is there a cost to it? Like how does people go about it if they want you to mentor them?
So in terms of process, typically if someone goes to my blog site and they just click on a link, they end up being able to WhatsApp me directly. And then I send them a screening form, which they fill in online. And then we have a conversation. I tell them, ask a few more questions about their background to get a better picture of who they are. And then I talk in great detail about how we'd work together. Because I always see this as a joint project. I love working with people, and I love finding someone who is interested in making their lives better. And so I see it as, two people working on a problem. It just so happens that one of them is living the problem. But both of them are sort of scientists in the problem. And I'm sort of think of myself as being the senior scientist, sort of holding the hand of the junior scientist, teaching them the methodologies and getting them up to speed so that they can then kind of go off and become scientists in their own way on their own lives later on. But once we have this conversation and they understand how the whole thing works and how I can mentor them no matter where in the world they live. And many of the people I mentor I've never met in person, yet I've been able to transform their lives, whether it's getting rid of medication they've been taking for many years, or alcoholism, stopping cigarettes, or just, they've generally been fit and healthy, but to get even fitter. Once people understand that this is sort of how it would work and they're keen, then I talk about how sort of this monthly payment sort of program works. There's no lock-in. It's literally, pay as you go. So it's not like a gym membership where you pay for the year, you go for a month, and then you give them 11 months of your fee for nothing. So
very cool. And so I recommend everyone check out purutheguru.me. It's Puru's blog. A lot of good content there. I'm glad I was plugged into it. So any like closing thoughts that you'd like to leave us with, Puru, before we close out?
I guess my closing thought would be just this: keep looking for the implementation gap, and remember that it's the refusal to think that is evil, right? And that's I guess individuals themselves aren't bad. It's just our actions and things that are bad, not the individual. So we can always change and get better.
Beautiful. Right. I'll make some closing announcements in a moment, but thank you for your wise words today, my friend.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. And tomorrow we have another event at this time at 10 a.m. Eastern time. Vandana Shiva is coming in. I think she's calling in from India as well, on International Small Farm Agroecology. So that's tomorrow at 10 a.m. Eastern time. You can check that out under the Doomer Optimism series. So that being said, Puru, everyone, thank you so much for coming to the Stoa today.
Thank you. Thank you.